Have you ever looked someone in the eyes and seen nothing? Not sadness, not anger, not even calm. Just an absence. A void behind the smile. It's hard to explain. You want to trust the words they're saying, the warmth they're imitating. But something inside you tugs soft and primal whispering. This person is not like the others. It doesn't make sense logically. They're charismatic, maybe even funny, generous in just the right doses. But something about them feels hollow, like you're speaking to a reflection that doesn't reflect you back. And when things go wrong, when they lie or betray or disappear, they offer no remorse, no genuine apology, just a blankness. Like what happened didn't register as wrong, because to them maybe it wasn't. This video isn't about monsters. It's about minds, specifically the kind of mind that can observe human pain like a painting on a wall, distant, disconnected, almost curious. We're diving into the strange, unsettling world of psychopathy, not with fear, not with judgment, but with a quiet, searching honesty. Because understanding darkness, especially the kind that wears a human face, is part of understanding yourself. And the truth is, we've all worn masks. We've all shut off empathy to survive. But what happens when that mask becomes permanent, when survival turns into strategy, and when connection becomes currency? Like and subscribe if this feels like home. You're not the only one who wonders what lives behind the perfect smile. And in the comments, tell me what thought keeps you up at night. Because sometimes it's not the scream in the night that chills us. It's the silence in someone's eyes that never seemed to blink. There's a moment, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when you lock eyes with someone and instead of feeling seen, you feel studied. Not admired, not judged, just observed like a lab rat in a sterile experiment. It doesn't alarm you at first. In fact, you might even feel flattered. They seem intensely interested. Their attention is focused. Their smile is smooth. Their words drip with attentiveness. But something is missing, something warm, messy, human. There's no flicker of shared feeling, no soft mirroring of your inner state. It's as if your emotions are being filed away like data points in a system designed to mimic connection, not experience it. This is the beginning of what some call the empty gaze. And once you've seen it, it's hard to forget. You might meet them at a dinner party, or during a late-night conversation when everyone else has gone home. Maybe they tell you their dreams with perfect timing, letting you in just enough to feel special. Maybe they make you laugh, disarm you, offer a compliment that feels impossibly tailored to the wound you didn't know was showing. It's intoxicating, like you've met someone who really gets you. But deep down, there's a chill, like standing in a room that looks cozy but never quite warms up. You tell yourself not to be paranoid. You want to believe. You want to trust. From a neuroscience perspective, this can be traced back to something specific: mirror neurons. In most of us, these neurons light up when we watch someone smile or cry or yawn. They help us feel what others feel, even if we don't consciously try. They are the bridge of empathy. But in psychopathy, research shows a significant reduction in mirror neuron activation. The bridge is damaged, and sometimes it's never built at all. That's not to say these individuals don't know how emotions work. On the contrary, many of them understand emotions so well that they can simulate them better than most. But it's a performance, a highly skilled one, and behind the act is a void. It's important not to confuse this with introversion or social awkwardness. Those traits still carry feeling. A shy person might avoid your gaze, but their emotions pulse beneath the surface. A person with social anxiety may seem cold at first, but they feel too much, not too little. The empty gaze is different. It's not rooted in fear or self-doubt. It's rooted in calculation, a cool clinical scan of your emotional architecture. You are not being seen. You are being read. This is where the paradox begins, because these people often present as magnetic, confident, even generous, and you feel drawn in, not pushed away. How can someone so attentive be so detached? How can someone say all the right words and feel so wrong? You start to doubt yourself. Maybe you're overthinking, maybe you're projecting. That's part of the trap. They are often charming because they have learned charm like a second language, fluent in affection, but without a native accent of sincerity. Imagine a beautifully crafted mannequin placed in a storefront window. Its features are perfect, its posture inviting, and if you squint, it almost looks alive. But walk up close, lean in, and you'll feel the difference. There's no breath behind the lips, no tension in the muscles, no flicker of soul behind the glassy eyes. That's the symbolic image of the empty gaze, a human-shaped reflection, with no pulse of empathy beneath. Soft question. Have you ever fallen in love with a reflection of yourself mirrored back to you by someone who never truly existed? The danger lies not just in who they are, but in who you become around them. You might find yourself working harder to be understood, to earn affection, to crack the mystery of their detachment. You try to offer warmth where there's cold, hoping that love will melt the ice. But what you're really doing is handing your vulnerability to someone who doesn't recognize its weight. They'll take it. They might even admire it, but they won't feel it. Not in the way you hope. And so, you become more expressive, more open. You offer pieces of your story, hoping for resonance. But it doesn't land. It gets analyzed, stored, maybe even used later. But not felt. That's the trauma of the empty gaze. It's not just that someone doesn't care. It's that they simulate caring so convincingly, you question your own senses. Carl Jung once wrote about the persona, the mask we wear in public to survive, to fit in. But the psychopath's mask isn't worn over the self. It is the self. There's no deeper layer beneath the performance. No secret vulnerability waiting to be revealed. And that's what makes this so difficult for emotionally attuned people. You're conditioned to believe that everyone has a wounded child inside, that love can reach them, that patience will crack the shell. But what if the shell is the person? In that realization, something shifts. You begin to understand that this isn't about evil, it's about absence, about a developmental gap where empathy never took root. These individuals are not haunted by guilt. They are untouched by it, and while that might make them dangerous, it also makes them empty. The gaze remains, polished, unblinking, curious, but never quite real. And the longer you stare into it, the more you lose the outlines of your own reflection. It's tempting to label them as monsters, to distance ourselves with moral absolutes, to say they're just born that way. It makes us feel safer, like there's a thick genetic wall separating us from them. But what if the truth is far less cinematic and far more human? What if instead of being born evil, they were simply born into a world where connection wasn't safe, where emotional closeness was inconsistent, manipulative, or non-existent, where a child reached out over and over and no one reached back? That's not the origin story of a villain. That's the origin story of a survivor. Gabor Mate often says that trauma isn't what happens to you. It's what happens inside you when you're alone with what happened. When a child's needs aren't met, especially the need for attunement, for being felt, held, mirrored, their nervous system adapts. It shuts off the parts that ache too loudly. It closes doors that lead to pain, and in the silence that follows, the seeds of psychopathy can quietly take root. Not as evil, not as malice, but as absence. Emotional absence born of emotional abandonment. A newborn can't regulate their own emotional state. They borrow their caregiver's nervous system to feel safe, to learn trust, to recognize patterns in warmth and rhythm. But if that caregiver is cold, inconsistent, neglectful, or violent, the child adapts in whatever way it must. Sometimes that adaptation looks like hyperempathy. The child becomes overly attuned to others, anxiously guessing moods over functioning to keep peace. But in other cases, the adaptation swings the opposite way. The child learns to feel less, to disconnect, to observe rather than participate, to protect their fragile nervous system by building a thick psychological skin, and eventually that skin becomes the self. Alfred Adler believed that all behavior is purposeful, even maladaptive behavior. He proposed that people don't act because of what happened in the past, but because of the goal they're unconsciously trying to reach. For the budding psychopath, the goal is simple: never be powerless again. Never need anyone enough to get hurt. Never feel enough to drown. And if that means silencing the part of the psyche that feels empathy, so be it. There's something tragic in that, isn't there? The paradox of the psychopath is this: they became who they are to survive, but in doing so, they lost access to the very thing that makes life meaningful: connection. They chose emotional self-preservation over vulnerability. Not because they're evil, but because the world taught them that vulnerability equals pain. Of course, not every child with a painful upbringing becomes psychopathic. The development of personality is a complex web shaped by temperament, genes, experiences, and culture. But in many cases, there is a clear pattern. Early neglect, paired with a lack of consistent emotional mirroring, leads to a form of relational numbness. The child learns that emotions are unpredictable, dangerous, or irrelevant, so they stop engaging with them. And what's left is a blueprint for disconnection. Imagine a young boy who cries and no one comes, not once, not twice, but every time. Imagine a girl who expresses joy or sadness and receives indifference or worse, punishment. Eventually, the child stops expressing. Then they stop feeling, not all at once, but gradually, like a dimmer switch being turned down until the lights go out. They still learn the mechanics of interaction. They may still smile when expected, speak politely, imitate affection. But the feeling behind the action is gone, or never fully formed. And here's where it gets even more complicated, because these individuals don't feel broken. They often feel superior, detached from messy emotion, immune to guilt, unburdened by the vulnerability that weighs others down. They look at the emotional chaos around them, the heartbreaks, the betrayals, the anxious attachments, and think, why would anyone want to feel like that? The symbolic image here is an astronaut who cut their tether from the ship. They're floating freely. No gravity, no weight, no fear of falling. But also, no oxygen. No way back. And they can't see that they're suffocating because they've never known what breathing with someone feels like. There's no question that some people with psychopathic traits cause harm. Sometimes deep, lasting harm. But if we're willing to look beneath the surface, we might see that the very traits we fear, emotional coldness, manipulation, lack of remorse, are often born from emotional deprivation, not malice. From a child who was never mirrored, so they grew up without a mirror inside. Soft question. If your capacity to feel was shaped by how others felt you, who might you have become in their absence? It's not about justifying cruelty. It's about understanding the origin of disconnection. Because when we pathologize people too quickly, we lose the thread of compassion not just for them, but for ourselves. Many of us, especially those who grew up emotionally neglected, have moments when we shut off, go numb, pretend we're fine, manipulate to get needs met. Those are micro-survivals, small echoes of a bigger silence. Carl Jung called the parts of ourselves we deny or reject the shadow. And in every one of us, the shadow holds moments of disconnection, times we didn't care when we should have, times we used charm instead of truth, times we saw suffering and looked away. The psychopath doesn't create the shadow, they simply live inside it. So maybe we're not as different as we think. Maybe the boundary between normal and pathological is thinner than we want to admit. And maybe, just maybe, when we see the coldness in someone else's eyes, it's not about fear, it's about recognition. You've probably met them, at work, at school, at a party. Maybe they shook your hand too firmly. Maybe their smile arrived a second too early, too practiced. But they seemed normal. More than normal, composed, articulate, maybe even magnetic. They remembered your name. They asked the right questions. They laughed when you laughed. It was easy to like them. And that's exactly what makes it so hard to see. Because the most unsettling psychopaths don't stand out. They blend in seamlessly. The predator becomes invisible not by hiding, but by performing. In 1941, psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley published a book called The Mask of Sanity. It was one of the first serious explorations into psychopathy as more than just criminal behavior, as a condition marked by a contradiction. Cleckley described patients who appeared entirely normal, even charming, yet left behind trails of devastation, broken relationships, stolen trust and pain that never registered in their expressions. He called it a mask not because they were hiding something dark underneath, but because there was often nothing behind the mask at all. It's a haunting image, someone whose face reflects all the right emotions, whose words carry all the right tones. And yet they are emotionally hollow. You search their eyes for flickers of empathy, but the light is artificial. Like walking past a department store mannequin, lifelike in posture but lifeless in presence. You wonder, how can someone be so convincingly human and feel nothing at all? Here's the paradox. The more polished the mask, the deeper the absence. Most people's flaws are visible in the way they stumble. But a psychopath's flaw is invisible, hidden in the way they don't. They never stammer in guilt. They don't hesitate in apology. Their stories are airbrushed, their expressions timed. And that's why people trust them. Not because they're real, but because they seem more consistent than real people ever are. In psychology, there's a concept called surface structure, the observable behavior or presentation someone shows. Underneath that lies deep structure, the unconscious beliefs, motivations, and emotional layers that drive behavior. Most of us operate with tension between the two. We smile, but we're anxious. We talk, but we're insecure. Our inner world leaks into the outer one. But for a high-functioning psychopath, that leak is sealed. The surface is immaculate, and the depth is missing. This mask isn't just for show. It's strategic. It gains trust. It opens doors. It builds influence. And it's often mistaken for strength. You might find them in high places, in politics, in boardrooms, on stages, not because they're faking their way up, but because their emotional detachment gives them an edge. They don't flinch. They don't spiral. They don't need approval. And in a world obsessed with composure, that can look like leadership. But watch closely. When someone shares pain with them, the mask nods. But the eyes don't change. When something tragic happens, their words echo sympathy. But their posture never shifts. It's empathy without temperature, concern without friction, like a pre-recorded response on a loop. And if you ever get close enough, if you let them in, the mask becomes harder to ignore. Maybe they betray you, but deny it flawlessly. Maybe they hurt someone and speak of it like a weather report. You feel confused. You want to believe them. Their face says everything you've been conditioned to trust. But your body knows. Your intuition tightens. Your breath shortens. And you're left with the kind of doubt that doesn't come from lies, but from the absence of truth. Soft question. Have you ever felt a deeper loneliness in the presence of someone than in their absence? The symbolic image here is a porcelain mask. Smooth, smiling, almost beautiful, but cold, fragile, hollow. And when it cracks, if it cracks, there's no monster behind it. Just more porcelain. Another smile, another script. The same performance in a different scene. Carl Jung's idea of persona helps us understand this. The persona is the social mask we wear, the role we play to fit into the world. But Jung warned that when the persona is mistaken for the self, the true self is lost. In the psychopath, this confusion is complete. The mask is not a defense, it's the whole identity. There is no inner voice of conscience wrestling with guilt. There is no soft shame whispering at the edges of the mask, only performance, only calculation. And still they often seem successful, even admired. Because society rewards the appearance of stability more than the reality of humanity. We trust what looks composed. We follow what sounds certain. And in that gap between how people appear and who they are, the mask thrives. This isn't meant to demonize. It's meant to observe gently. Because some of us wear masks too, not to harm others, but to survive, to be liked, to keep peace. And that makes the mask familiar. We recognize something in them that mirrors something in us, and that's what makes the encounter so magnetic and so dangerous. Eventually, the mask stops working. Not for them, for you. You begin to feel unseen even when they're looking at you, unheard even when they repeat your words. You start to question your own reality, because they reflect your surface, but never your soul. And the longer you try to connect, the more your spirit starves. You may walk away with no evidence of harm, no bruises, no threats, just the subtle erosion of self, like trying to love a statue back to life. And in the silence that follows, you might ask yourself, was any of it real? Did they ever feel what I felt? And the answer quietly is no. But they were very good at pretending. Control to most people feels like domination, power, force. But to a psychopath, control is not always about power for its own sake. It's about safety, about certainty, about ensuring that no one else ever gets close enough to touch the levers of their internal world. Because closeness means risk, and risk, the emotional kind, is intolerable, so instead of connection, they build systems, invisible silent systems of control, where every interaction is a calculation, every relationship a strategy, and every feeling they offer you is a choice, not a response. It doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looks generous. They do you a favor. They remember a small detail. They offer just enough praise to keep you near, just enough attention to keep you trying. But underneath the gestures is a kind of quiet architecture, a way of arranging people, places, and emotions into a structure where they remain in control. Not necessarily in charge, just unexposed, untouched. This is the cold logic of control. It isn't loud, it's not reactive. It's often calm, even pleasant. But it is always self-serving. Every move serves the same purpose: preserve the image, protect the core, maintain the advantage. Not out of spite, but because it's the only way they know how to feel secure. If you were never emotionally safe growing up, you learn to stop trusting anyone's love. And instead of intimacy, you choose control. You build distance. You manage perception. You keep people guessing, because if they're guessing, they're not getting close. Soft paradox, they're not trying to hurt you. They're just not trying not to. You may find yourself wondering why they do certain things, why they disappear when things get emotional, why they undermine your confidence subtly, never enough to be obvious, but just enough to make you unsure, why they withhold information, or affection, or closure. These aren't always acts of malice, sometimes they're acts of avoidance. If they give you too much, you'll get too close. And closeness for them means potential exposure, so they ration themselves, carefully, precisely. Symbolic image, a glass chessboard mid-game in a frozen room. No one's speaking, but every piece is being moved with intention. The goal isn't to win loudly, it's to never lose position. There's something hauntingly efficient about how they navigate intimacy. They may tell you what you want to hear. They may learn your fears, your hopes, your triggers, and then use them. Not always out of cruelty, but out of design. Emotions are tools in their world, leverage, buttons, not shared experiences but pressure points. This becomes especially visible in arguments. While you rage, cry, explain, plead, they remain steady, calm, unbothered, and that calmness in the beginning feels mature, grounded, but over time it becomes eerie, detached. You realize they're not hearing you, they're watching you, logging what works, what you need, what you'll settle for. Alfred Adler believed that all human behavior is goal-directed, even when it seems irrational. So what is the goal here? It's not to love. It's not even to dominate. It's to remain untouchable. To control the conditions of every relationship so thoroughly that emotional vulnerability never enters the room. And if that means distorting your reality a little, so be it. You might find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, wondering if you're too sensitive, losing your center. That's not accidental. When someone controls the narrative, they control your perception, and when you no longer trust your own emotions, you become dependent on theirs. That's the most subtle form of control, not through force, but through erosion. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In the presence of a psychopath, your unconscious wounds are often activated. The part of you that longs for approval, that fears abandonment, that believes love must be earned. These are the parts they intuitively sense and quietly steer, not because they understand them deeply, but because they know how to manipulate the surface. And this is where the damage happens, not in the blow, but in the slow, bending. In the thousand small ways, you adapt. You stop asking for too much. You rationalize the coldness. You explain away the silence. You tell yourself they're just not good with emotions. But deep down you feel it. This isn't a skill issue. It's a strategy. Soft question. What parts of yourself have you silenced just to keep the peace with someone who never planned to offer you any? Eventually the control stops being hidden. It leaks out in moments, the subtle digs, the gaslighting, the way they weaponize your vulnerability or twist your words with a smirk, and you realize they were never confused. They were never unaware. They were just maintaining control, quietly, always. But the real trap is that part of you still hopes. Hopes that if you're just calmer, nicer, clearer, they'll finally see you, finally care. But they don't need to care to control, and they don't need to feel love to simulate it. What they need is your belief, your willingness to stay, your trust in the mask. And when that cracks, when you stop reacting, when you stop engaging, they'll often walk away emotionless. No apology, no reflection, just a clean break. Because once control is gone, the game ends. And they never play games they can't win. So if you felt that chill, that calculated calm, know this, you weren't imagining it. Your body knew before your mind did that the warmth you felt was strategic, that the connection you chased was a performance, and that the person in front of you wasn't sharing power. They were orchestrating silence. It's easy to believe that empathy is always good, that the ability to understand someone's emotions, to feel what they feel, is inherently healing. And for most people, it is. Empathy connects, softens, binds. But in the wrong hands, empathy isn't a bridge. It's a blade. Because to truly manipulate someone, you must first understand them. And that understanding begins with empathy, not the kind that moves the heart, but the kind that maps it, quietly, precisely, strategically. The psychopath doesn't lack the understanding of emotion. In fact, they often understand it better than most. They observe it, analyze it, memorize its cues, but they don't feel it in the same way. It doesn't reach them, doesn't move them. And because of that, they use it differently. Where you might use empathy to build trust, they use it to exploit it. You open up thinking you're being heard, but really you're being studied. Every detail you share, every insecurity, every desire, every hesitation becomes material, something they can use later quietly without warning. You might say something vulnerable maybe about your childhood, your fear of abandonment, your need to feel seen. And they nod, they lean in, they say all the right words, they seem safe. But what they're doing is filing your heart away like a document. And when the moment comes when they need you, compliant or apologetic or chasing, they pull that file. And they press the exact button you hoped they never would. Soft paradox. The more deeply they understand you, the easier it is to hurt you. There's a term in psychology called cognitive empathy. It's the ability to recognize what someone else is feeling, to read facial expressions, tone, body language, without necessarily feeling it yourself. Most people have both cognitive and emotional empathy working together, but psychopaths tend to excel in the cognitive domain. They know how to read the room. They know how to mirror your posture, match your energy, echo your words. It feels like resonance, but it's imitation. And this imitation is so subtle, so convincing, that you often don't realize what's happening until much later, when you look back and realize how much of yourself you gave away to someone who never truly met you. They weren't moved by your story. They were mapping it. Symbolic image. A locked diary opened by someone with a stolen key, flipping through pages they don't respect, only looking for something useful. This is where the weaponization of empathy becomes most dangerous, because it feels like connection. And your nervous system responds accordingly. You bond, you relax, you trust, but you're bonding with a mask. And the moment your loyalty becomes inconvenient, the empathy disappears. You're left confused, reaching for a connection that never truly existed. Have you ever tried to explain to someone what happened, how you were manipulated, how the kindness felt real, and they just didn't get it? They saw a charming person, a helpful person, maybe even a generous one, and you felt like the crazy one, like maybe you were too sensitive, too dramatic, but you weren't. You were empathized and not empathized with, and that difference is subtle, but devastating. Gabor Mate writes that when children aren't truly felt by their caregivers, they learn to adapt, to perform, to become what's expected of them in order to receive attention. But psychopaths flip that script. They become the ones doing the reading, the adapting, the performing, not to receive love, but to control it, to direct it, to weaponize it. And yet, there's still something in you that wants to believe, that wants to think the kindness was real, the words were real, the softness was real. Because it's painful to admit, you are opened up not out of love, but for leverage. Soft question. What if the deepest betrayal is not being lied to, but being emotionally understood only to be used? This kind of manipulation doesn't scream. It doesn't hit. It doesn't threaten. It whispers. It mimics. It wraps itself in your language and feeds off your story. And when it leaves quietly, taking nothing tangible, but everything sacred. You might notice this pattern in hindsight. A strange consistency in how they show up for people. They always say the right thing. They always appear generous. But their relationships don't last. Their closeness is selective. And they disappear without mourning. Because for them, empathy is a transaction. It has no cost, no residue. It's a strategy. And once it's served its purpose, it's discarded. This doesn't mean we stop trusting people. It doesn't mean we close ourselves off. But it does mean we slow down. We listen not just to words, but to weight. Because real empathy has weight. It lingers. It shifts posture. It changes behavior. It doesn't just say, I understand you. It shows up when things get messy. And the person who uses empathy as a weapon, they vanish when the mess begins. Or worse, they use your mess as proof that you are the unstable one. Carl Jung believed that people project their shadow onto others, that we see in them the parts of ourselves we don't want to face. And perhaps what makes these experiences so painful is that the manipulator doesn't hide their shadow. They use yours. They weaponize your hope, your tenderness, your willingness to trust. And when you finally walk away, when you reclaim your voice, your boundaries, your reality, you'll grieve something that never quite existed. Not a person, a performance. You've probably felt it. That quiet ache in your chest after saying something harsh. That restless energy in your body when you realize you crossed a line. The regret that arrives uninvited, replaying the moment in slow motion, asking you not cruelly but firmly, why did you do that? This is the voice of guilt. It's not pleasant, but it's necessary. It keeps us tethered to our conscience. It reminds us that others exist outside our own experience, and that their pain matters. But for a psychopath, that voice isn't there. Not because it was silenced, but because it never developed. This is one of the hardest things to understand about the psychopathic mind. They don't feel bad when they hurt you. Not later, not quietly, not secretly. There's no internal courtroom, no late-night apology rehearsed in their mind, no heaviness after betrayal. Because guilt, real guilt, requires empathy. It requires an emotional resonance between your action and its impact. And for them, that resonance doesn't exist. Neurologically, studies have shown decreased activity in two key regions of the psychopathic brain. The amygdala, which processes fear and emotional salience, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which helps weigh emotional consequences. Without full access to these systems, moral feedback loops are weakened. It's not that they choose to ignore guilt, it's that they never feel it in the first place. Symbolic image, a hallway of mirrors, but each mirror reflects only the self. No matter how many people they hurt, they only ever see their own outline. This absence of guilt explains so much. The ease with which they lie, the cold precision of their manipulation, the silence after they ghost you, betray you, or humiliate you. You wait for the moment of remorse, the message, the apology, the look in their eyes that says, I'm sorry. But it never comes, not because they're stubborn, not because they're evil, but because they don't feel they've done anything wrong. Soft paradox. They know what guilt looks like, but not what it feels like. And so they imitate it. If caught, they'll offer the words, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry you feel that way. But their voice is flat. Their face too still. It's a performance without pulse. And you can feel it, can't you? That absence behind the apology, that emotional blankness wrapped in familiar language. You might try to explain to them how you feel, to paint your pain in vivid colors, hoping they'll finally see. But their response remains clinical, defensive, dismissive, or worse, amused, and you start to doubt yourself. You wonder, am I too much, too sensitive, too dramatic? But the truth is simpler. You're responding to a real rupture, and they're not, because their internal compass doesn't register the damage. This is not the same as narcissism, though the two often overlap. Narcissists may feel guilt, but suppress it with denial or rationalization. Psychopaths simply don't register it. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's never seen it. They might understand the theory, but the feeling never arrives. Carl Jung spoke often of the ethical conscience, the internal voice that connects us to collective values. Without it, a person becomes unmoored, capable of cruelty without remorse. But not necessarily because they desire cruelty. Sometimes they're simply indifferent to it. And here's where it gets haunting. Because that indifference, that lack of remorse, can actually feel like strength. In a world where so many are crushed by guilt, where people over-apologize and over-own mistakes, the psychopath's calm seems enviable. They move on quickly, sleep easily, make decisions without emotional hesitation. But that ease comes at a cost. The same lack of guilt that protects them from shame also isolates them from connection. Soft question. If someone never feels guilt, can they ever truly feel love? Love at its core requires care, concern, the willingness to be affected by another's pain. Not just to witness it, but to feel it, to let it shape you. And guilt is part of that shaping. It's what teaches us to repair, to grow, to be safe for others. Without it, relationships become transactional, performative, conditional. You may find yourself playing detective, searching for signs of guilt, waiting for the moment they'll crack, show vulnerability, admit fault. But they never do, not because they're strong, but because the wiring isn't there. And the longer you wait, the more exhausted you become, pouring emotional energy into a well that never echoes back. This is why closure with a psychopath often feels impossible. You're speaking in a language they don't speak. You're hoping for a kind of resolution they don't offer. And when they move on quickly, cleanly, without a backward glance, it cuts deeper than any word they ever said. Because guilt isn't just about morality. It's about memory. It's what keeps relationships sacred, what makes harm matter, and in its absence everything becomes disposable. Some of the most painful moments come when they hurt. You see your pain and simply continue. No pause, no change, no regret. Just a slow turning of the page, as if your chapter never existed. But don't mistake their indifference for truth. Your pain is still real. Your boundaries were still crossed, your love was still given, and the absence of guilt in them doesn't invalidate the depth in you. Carl Jung warned that when we engage too closely with the shadow, especially in others, we risk losing our own light. And in the presence of a person who feels no remorse, it's easy to forget your own worth, to think that your reaction is the problem. That if you were stronger, calmer, more forgiving, they would feel something. But they won't. Because guilt is not a skill you can teach. It's a signal that must already be there. And if it's not, no amount of explaining will make them care. Confidence is magnetic. We're drawn to it instinctively, the way someone walks into a room without apology, speaks, without hesitation, holds eye contact like gravity itself. It soothes our own uncertainty, makes us feel safe, seen, led. And in a world full of overthinking and doubt, that kind of certainty feels like a balm. But confidence is not always what it seems. Sometimes it's rooted in clarity, earned through inner work. And sometimes it's empty, performed, detached from conscience, untethered from complexity. This is the seduction of the psychopath, not in cruelty, but in composure. There's a paradox here. The less someone feels guilt, anxiety, shame, the more clearly they appear to operate. While others wrestle internally, second-guessing their motives or replaying their words at night, the psychopath glides forward. No hesitation, no doubt. Their voice doesn't shake. Their logic sounds flawless. Their certainty never breaks, and so we trust them. Soft paradox. Sometimes the most believable person is the one who believes nothing at all. In evolutionary terms, confidence signals competence. Leaders are chosen not because they're always right, but because they appear sure. And that's where psychopathic traits become especially potent, because when you remove the burden of empathy, the noise of emotional doubt, you're left with something that looks like strength, and the world often rewards it. We see this in high-status professions, CEOs, lawyers, surgeons, politicians. Not all, of course, but enough to notice a pattern. A certain breed of charm, smooth, persuasive, immune to awkwardness. They don't just walk into a room, they own it, and people respond not to who they are, but to what they represent. Stability, clarity, control. Symbolic image, a lighthouse standing tall in a storm, but when you get close you realize it's hollow. No stairs, no keeper, just light, automated and cold. This type of confidence can be intoxicating in relationships. They pursue you with clarity. No mixed signals, no bashfulness. They say the things you always hoped someone would say, directly, eloquently, at just the right time. And at first it feels like safety, like finally being chosen without conditions. But something feels off. They're too polished, too immune. They never seem rattled even when they should be. You open your heart and they don't flinch, which feels reassuring at first until you realize they also don't respond. Because the confidence isn't rooted in self-awareness. It's rooted in detachment. They're not vulnerable to rejection because they don't register emotional stakes the way others do. So they play the game with ease. No nerves, no cost. And in that game, you fall. Have you ever noticed how the person who never panics makes you feel like they must know something you don't? That their stillness must mean wisdom. But in this case, the stillness is emotional absence, not mastery. It's not that they've conquered fear, it's that they never felt it to begin with. Soft question. Have you ever mistaken someone's calm for depth only to find it was just distance? This is where the lines blur. Because we want to believe that composure comes from strength, that presence means grounding. But in the psychopathic mind, presence is performance. It's curated. And because they study human behavior so well, they can reflect back whatever persona you need them to be. The confident partner, the stable mentor, the charming friend. They read your hunger for certainty and they become it. Carl Jung warned of this kind of false self, a persona so complete, so admired, that it replaces the real self. For the psychopath, that replacement is total. There's no internal conflict, no tension between public and private, just one seamless projection. And we believe it because most of us are still trying to reconcile our own contradictions. This seduction doesn't always happen through words. It's in the timing, the way they wait to speak, the way they pause just long enough to seem thoughtful but not long enough to seem unsure. It's in the way they never apologize unless it serves a purpose, the way they offer eye contact like a mirror showing you what you want to see but never reflecting what's true. Eventually the cracks show. Their decisions start to reveal a lack of concern. They cross boundaries with ease. They shift blame without blinking. And yet, they still sound convincing. That's what keeps you hooked. Not the logic, the tone, the confidence. Because you've been conditioned to trust the person who doesn't tremble. But you're beginning to see the truth that confidence without conscience is just control in a suit. It looks like leadership, but it leads nowhere. Symbolic image, a golden compass that always points north until you realize it's been magnetized to spin for whoever holds it. This isn't a warning to distrust everyone who seems composed, but it is an invitation to look deeper. To ask yourself not just what someone is saying, but why it feels good to hear it. Are they speaking to your truth or to your wounds? Are they steady because they've done the work, or because they've never let anything in? And perhaps the deeper question is this: why do we long so deeply for someone who doesn't doubt what part of us wants to be led, even at the cost of being known? Because sometimes the seduction of confidence isn't about the other person at all. It's about our own hunger to escape uncertainty, our own fatigue with being the one who cares too much, feels too deeply, questions too often. And in that exhaustion we mistake coldness for clarity, detachment for depth. But eventually we remember true strength isn't the absence of emotion. It's the ability to feel and still stay present. Some people play games to win, but psychopaths, they play games to stay in motion, not toward a goal, but away from exposure, away from stillness, because stillness reveals too much. So the game never ends. It loops, morphs, starts over, shifts players. It's not about love, not about connection. It's about control through confusion, closeness through chaos. And if you've ever been close to someone like this, you know the strange ache of it, the way clarity always seems just a few steps away, like a maze whose center keeps moving. They begin with intensity, idealization, a rush of closeness so swift, so overwhelming it feels fated. They seem fascinated by you, attuned to you, like you've finally found someone who speaks your inner language. You feel chosen, understood, needed, and you let your guard down. But slowly, subtly, the rhythm shifts. The attention fades, the warmth turns cool. They stop responding with the same spark. They forget details they once memorized, you feel them slipping, and you try to close the distance. You ask what's wrong, you offer more, try harder, be softer, be clearer. And in doing so, the game tightens, because now you're chasing. Soft paradox. The moment you seek consistency from them, they become unpredictable. This cycle is known in psychological circles as idealize, devalue, discard. But in psychopathy, it's not always conscious. It's instinctual. Intimacy becomes suffocating. Predictability makes them feel seen, and being seen feels dangerous. So they pull away. Not with cruelty, but with coldness, a shrug, a ghosting, a subtle shift that says, "You were never real to me, just a part of the performance." And yet, they don't always leave. Sometimes they linger, just enough to keep the thread alive. A message here, a late-night call, a breadcrumb, and you follow it. Because the beginning felt so real, so vivid. You want to believe that version still exists. Symbolic image, a labyrinth drawn in chalk on wet stone, beautiful, complex, but dissolving underfoot the moment you try to walk it. Psychopaths don't fear your love. They fear what love asks of them. Transparency, vulnerability, accountability. So they offer the appearance of intimacy, without the cost. They use your longing as leverage. Every time you ask, "Do you still care?" they win. Because now you're orbiting them, trying to decode what went wrong. Carl Jung wrote about the trickster archetype, the shapeshifter, the boundary crosser, the figure who plays. by no rules but their own. The psychopath is a living embodiment of that archetype in its shadow form. Not to enlighten or provoke growth, but to destabilize, to maintain the upper hand through ambiguity. What makes this so damaging is not the overt cruelty. It's the erosion of your sense of reality. You begin to question yourself. Were you too needy, too intense? Did you misread everything? You replay moments, look for signs. You want the narrative to make sense. But it doesn't, because there is no fixed narrative, just fragments, loops, games with no endings. Soft question. How many times have you confused unpredictability with depth thinking? Someone was mysterious when they were really just unaccountable. They don't offer closure, not because they can't, but because closure is a door, and doors give you power, the power to leave. So instead they leave the door open just enough, a memory, a message, a vague promise, and you stay near it wondering when they'll walk back through. And when you try to end things, they may suddenly return with charm apology, attention, but only long enough to re-establish control. Once the game resets, the pattern begins again. You are idealized, then slowly discarded, then baited, then discarded again. Why does this happen? Because in the absence of emotional resonance, games are the only way they feel engagement. They don't experience relationships as mutual journeys. They experience them as arenas, places where they perform. Test, manipulate, win, not because they hate you, but because the game is safer than genuine contact. There's something devastatingly empty in this. Not rage, not hatred, just indifference. You're not a villain, you're not a beloved, you're a variable, a role, a mirror. And when the reflection no longer serves, they turn away not abruptly but subtly, casually, as if you never mattered. And yet, you remember how they looked at you, how they knew your favorite song, the way they held your gaze like it meant something. And it did. To you. That's the ache. The grief of giving your authentic self to someone who never planned to offer theirs in return. This is why the aftermath can be so destabilizing. You don't just lose the relationship. You lose your orientation, your sense of emotional gravity. You don't know where true ends and performance begins. And in that confusion, you begin to disappear, not because they erased you, but because you kept chasing something that never existed. Symbolic image, a candle flickering in a hall of mirrors, lighting everything but warming nothing. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious in others can become a teacher if we're willing to see it. In this case, perhaps the lesson is this, that not every kind of attention is love, that not every connection is safe, and that your sensitivity, your depth is not a flaw, it's just something they could never hold. Eventually, the game ends, not because they stop playing, but because you stop participating. You stop explaining, stop chasing, stop responding, and in that quiet refusal, you reclaim yourself. And what you find once the dust settles is a deeper kind of strength, the kind that no longer confuses chaos for passion, the kind that sees through charm, the kind that no longer wants to solve someone else's maze because you've remembered the way back to your own center. Love, when it's real, is messy. It's late-night vulnerability, quiet repair, imperfect truth spoken in shaky voices. It's presence, not performance. But when you love a psychopath, or rather when you think you do, something feels slightly off from the start. Not wrong exactly, just scripted, polished, like they're acting out the idea of love rather than feeling it. And because the performance is so good, you play along. You believe. You respond. You open. And somewhere along the way, you mistake the echo of love for the real thing. In the early days, it's everything you hoped for. Intense eye contact, consistent attention, phrases that sound lifted from poetry, intimate, specific, disarming. They study you carefully and reflect back the most desirable version of themselves, not out of affection, but precision. It's as if they've read your heart's script before you even wrote it. You feel seen, chosen, finally understood. But behind the gestures, something is missing. When you cry, they comfort you, but it feels mechanical. When you share a fear, they acknowledge it, but it doesn't land. When you need depth, they offer timing. Rhythms, beats, cues, not soul. The warmth is there, but not the heat. Soft paradox, they don't love you, they love how it looks to love you. This is not because they're malicious. It's because love to them is transactional. It's a role, a function, a means to an end. If the performance secures loyalty, admiration, compliance, then they perform. Flawlessly, until it no longer serves. You may sense this in subtle moments: a pause too long before the "I love you," an emptiness behind the gaze during sex, a lack of curiosity about your inner world unless it's relevant to their agenda. They smile at the right time. They hold your hand when appropriate. But you can feel it, the disconnect, the hollow echo of affection. Symbolic image: a theater stage with a single spotlight illuminating an actor who never steps off set because the character is all they know. This kind of love doesn't grow. It loops. It recycles the same lines, the same gestures without evolving. There's no deepening, no mutual transformation. You remain emotionally available, hoping that at some point the real person will emerge. But what you've seen is the person. The performance isn't hiding a self, it is the self. Carl Jung warned that people often mistake their personas, their social masks, for their identity. For the psychopath, that mistake is complete. They don't step into love. They step into character. And because they've observed others so well, they know which expressions work, which phrases open hearts, which gestures generate trust. They know the dance. They just don't hear the music. What makes this experience so disorienting is how much you feel, how authentic your love is. You care, you invest, you ache. And because of that, the contrast is invisible at first. You assume reciprocity. You project warmth onto their calm, depth onto their stillness. And when the mask slips, when they react to your pain with indifference or disappear after a moment of intimacy, you rationalize. You tell yourself they're scared, that they need more time, that they've been hurt. But underneath that hope is a slow dread. Because something in you knows this isn't fear, it's vacancy, soft question. What if they weren't afraid of loving you, but simply didn't know what love feels like? In psychology, the difference between attachment and performance is often traced back to early developmental experiences. A child who wasn't attuned to emotionally, whose needs were met inconsistently or manipulatively, learns that love is not a feeling, but a strategy. That affection is currency and vulnerability, a weakness to be used, not cherished. So they grow up learning not how to feel love, but how to simulate it. To give enough to stay desirable, but not enough to become vulnerable. And if someone gets too close, they retreat. Not out of fear of hurting you, but out of instinct to protect their own constructed self. This is why people often say it felt so real, until it didn't. Because it was real to you, but not to them, not in the way that word usually means. Symbolic image: a wax flower in a crystal vase, stunning, lifelike, unchanging, but untouched by sunlight, water, or time. Eventually the cracks appear. You ask for emotional intimacy. You express a need, you reveal pain. And suddenly the warmth cools. They grow impatient, dismissive, maybe even cruel. The role begins to unravel, and you're left staring at someone who once promised forever, now looking at you like a stranger. But the most painful part: they don't seem affected. There are no tears, no reflection, just a clean break, a disappearance, a new script with a new co-star, and you question everything. Did they ever love you, or did they just play the role of someone who would? That's the wound that lingers. Not the loss of the person, but the loss of the meaning. Because love, when performed, leaves no imprint. It doesn't change the actor, it only affects the audience. And in time you stop asking for answers. You stop hoping they'll realize what they lost, because you see clearly what they gave was never love. It was its shadow, its costume. And what you gave was real, even if it was never received. Step beyond the charm, beyond the smooth answers, the steady eye contact, the borrowed warmth. Step past the rehearsed affections and mirrored emotions. And what do you find? What lives inside the person who seems to move through life untouched by consequence, unshaken by conflict, immune to guilt or love? The answer isn't rage or madness or secret shame. It's silence, cold, organized, indifferent silence. The inner world of a psychopath isn't a storm. It's a vacuum. No chaos, no noise. Just a calculated stillness, like an empty vault, polished and sealed, echoing only its own emptiness. It's easy to imagine their inner life as tormented, a tortured soul hidden beneath the mask. But that's projection. That's your depth looking for reflection. The unsettling truth is they are not hiding something emotional. They are hiding nothing, or rather they are nothing emotionally. Not in a nihilistic sense, but in a sensory one. They don't experience the world the way most people do. Not through relational resonance, not through emotional consequence. They move through life as if on a mental map, not an emotional terrain. Everything, people, events, choices is just a dot to be navigated. Soft paradox, they're not haunted by the past because the past holds no emotional charge. This isn't to say they don't remember things. They do, often with remarkable detail. But their memories are like photographs in a museum labeled categorized untouched. You remember moments based on how they made you feel. They remember moments based on what they achieved. Emotion for them is information, not experience. Symbolic image, an ice palace with crystal walls, perfectly designed, beautifully symmetrical, and utterly uninhabited. When they plan for effect. Not connection, not impact, and certainly not remorse. Their mind is focused, often brilliant, but it does not bend toward others. It does not adapt out of care, it adapts for efficiency. You might see this in how they handle conflict. They don't argue, they neutralize. They don't reflect, they redirect. Their strategy isn't to feel their way through the world, but to master it. Carl Jung spoke of the self as a totality, a harmony between conscious intention and unconscious emotion. But in the psychopath, there's a kind of psychic fracture. The emotional unconscious is muted, underdeveloped, or sealed away. What remains is the conscious mind, moving freely unchecked by the deeper wisdom of feeling. This gives them an eerie clarity. They don't spiral, they don't hesitate, they don't wrestle with shame or fear. And while that might sound appealing, especially to the overthinker, the people pleaser, the empath, it's also what makes them so deeply unreachable. When you cry in front of them, their first response is not to comfort, but to assess. Is this a threat? A tool, a distraction? When you confess your love, they process it as an update, a variable shift, not a vulnerability. And when they hurt you, it doesn't land. There is no echo, no wound to mirror yours. Just a flat interior landscape immune to the ripples of emotional impact. Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt like you were falling? Into nothing. No anger, no warmth, no fear, just the absence of feeling dressed in the perfect mask. That's the moment you've touched the edge of their world. Soft question. What do we become when we stay too long in a space that reflects nothing back? For them, relationships are strategic alignments, not journeys of mutual discovery. They seek admiration, loyalty, submission, not because these things bring joy, but because they ensure control. Intimacy is unsettling, not because it's dangerous, but because it's inefficient. Why reveal the self when the image is enough? Why risk vulnerability when performance secures the same results? And so their inner world remains preserved, pristine, sterile. They may read books about emotion, study body language, consume stories of love and loss. But they do so like anthropologists fascinated by the rituals untouched by the experience. This isn't dramatic, it's quiet, chillingly quiet. There is no inner war, no regretful voice, just a smooth logic guiding every move. Even their cruelty is often unintentional. They don't hate, they don't need to hate. Hate requires energy, engagement, and they conserve theirs. Pain is neither relished nor resisted, it's simply irrelevant. And yet somehow they often rise. In business, in leadership, in influence. Why? Because the world rewards decisiveness, composure, the ability to act without hesitation. And they do, because when you're not weighed down by guilt, shame, or empathy, you move through doors others can't. But what's behind those doors, when the lights go out and no one's watching, what remains? Stillness. Not peace, because peace implies harmony. Not loneliness, because loneliness requires longing. Just stillness. Symbolic image, a snow-covered field under a full moon. Untouched, soundless, beautiful, but unwalked by human feet. It's tempting to think you can melt this ice, that your warmth, your love, your insight will awaken something in them. But that's your inner world projecting onto theirs. You're imagining a sleeping heart. What you're facing is an empty throne. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But what if the soul was never invited in the first place? What if, for some, the inner castle was never built to house one? And if that's true, your task is not to rescue them. It's to rescue yourself. From the quiet erasure of your feelings, from the slow draining of your reality, from the temptation to confuse mystery with meaning. Because their inner world may be still, but yours is alive. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries a shadow, the unseen, unclaimed, often unwanted parts of ourselves that we hide, repress, or deny. Anger, envy, desire, shame. These aren't flaws, they're fragments, as natural to us as light is to the sun. But when we push these parts away, when we refuse to look inward, the shadow doesn't disappear. It acts out. It leaks into our relationships, our decisions, our lives. And Jung warned that the more unconscious the shadow becomes, the more power it holds. But what happens when the shadow isn't just unacknowledged, but inhabited? What if the shadow is the self? That's where the psychopath lives, not in struggle with the shadow, but fused with it. Most of us feel tension between who we are and who we pretend to be. That tension is uncomfortable, but it's also a sign of inner life, of conscience, reflection, hope. It means there's something inside trying to grow. But in the psychopath, that tension is absent. There is no war between the mask and the soul. The mask is the soul. There's no inner conflict, no emotional recoil after harm, no wrestling with darker impulses, because those impulses aren't hidden. They're simply normal, integrated not as healed parts, but as central identities. Soft paradox. The rest of us fear becoming our darkness. The psychopath doesn't distinguish between light and dark at all. This absence of contrast makes them powerful and dangerous, because they don't just repress the shadow, they operate from it freely. Coldness becomes logic, deception becomes skill, dominance becomes charm. And since the world rarely teaches emotional fluency, many of us are ill-equipped to detect the difference. Symbolic image: a figure standing in front of a mirror, casting no reflection, not because they are invisible, but because the mirror itself refuses to show what cannot be felt. We all carry a shadow, but we also carry a longing to be good, to repair, to grow. That longing is what keeps us humble, empathetic, teachable. It's what makes us human. The psychopath lacks that longing, not out of rebellion, but out of absence. They didn't bury their goodness. They never built the structure that would hold it. This is important to understand, because when you engage with someone like this, you might keep waiting for the transformation moment, the breakdown, the apology, the glimpse of humanity. But for them, the shadow is not a temporary exile. It's home, and no amount of love will make them leave it. Jung also said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. And maybe that's why these encounters feel so destabilizing, because they force your shadow to the surface. Your need to be chosen, your fear of rejection, your fantasy of healing others to avoid healing yourself. The psychopath doesn't expose you by intention. They expose you by contrast. Their emptiness lights up your hunger. Their stillness awakens your ache. And suddenly you see all the parts of you you've tried to avoid reflected in someone who doesn't flinch at all. Soft question: what part of you stayed hoping that if they changed you wouldn't have to? The unintegrated shadow doesn't just live in the psychopath. It lives in the systems that reward them, in the workplaces that value results over relationships, in the relationships that romanticize detachment as power, in the culture that mistakes manipulation for influence. These shadows are collective, and unless we face them, we keep inviting them in. There's a temptation, especially among deeply empathetic people, to think they can rescue the shadow in others, that their love will soften what's hard, that their care will bring light to the cold, but you can't heal someone else's shadow by becoming smaller around it. You can't integrate their absence by abandoning your own presence. The real healing begins when you stop projecting your empathy outward and turn it inward. When you stop explaining their behavior and start exploring your pain. When you ask, not why did they do this, but why did I stay? And perhaps most importantly, when you forgive yourself for not seeing it sooner. Because they weren't just wearing a mask, they were wearing you, your desires, your language, your softness, reflected back to you like a spell, and breaking that spell takes time. Symbolic image: a candle burning beside a shadow that no longer moves. You may walk away from someone like this and feel nothing at first, just numbness, silence, confusion. But over time, the weight returns, not their weight, but yours. Your sense of self, your intuition, your voice, the parts of you that went dormant waiting to be mirrored, begin to wake up again. Jung believed that to truly grow, we must not just confront the shadow, but integrate it. To accept our darker impulses without being ruled by them. To claim our aggression as boundary, not harm. to know our anger without becoming it. This is where the psychopath fails. They don't integrate their darkness, they embody it without reflection. And in doing so, they lose access to the full range of human life. But you don't have to. Your shadow is not a threat. It's a door. A place where your unmet needs and unspoken fears wait for your attention. And once you walk through that door, you no longer seek validation from those who live in darkness. You no longer try to rescue what was never lost. You begin to build the kind of inner wholeness that cannot be manipulated because it no longer needs to be mirrored. At first it feels like a love story, or maybe a redemption story, a connection that was intense, raw, even sacred. You believed you were seeing someone no one else had seen, reaching a part of them that was hidden from the world. They let you in, or at least it seemed like they did. You felt chosen, and in being chosen, you felt needed. Important, maybe even destined. But what you didn't realize then was that the story wasn't about them. It was about you, and the longer you stayed, the more you disappeared inside their narrative. This is the identity trap, a slow, quiet unraveling of your sense of self, not because they forced you to change, but because you offered it willingly, piece by piece, out of love, out of hope, out of the desperate longing to mean something to someone who never truly meant anything at all. It begins with small shifts. You adjust your tone to avoid setting them off. You stop sharing certain feelings because they seem to misunderstand or dismiss them. You rationalize their coldness as independence, their manipulation as emotional complexity. You begin to change how you show up, not because you're growing, but because you're shrinking. Soft paradox, you became someone else just to be seen by someone who never really looked. This kind of transformation is subtle. There's no demand, no threat, just the invisible pressure to be who they need you to be. In order to keep the connection alive, you become agreeable, flexible, low maintenance. You praise their depth excuse, their cruelty, convince yourself that their indifference is wisdom. You lose your edge, your voice, your truth, and somewhere along the way you stop asking what you need. Because their approval, their presence becomes your compass. You measure your worth by their responses. You interpret their silence like scripture. You analyze their texts like sacred codes. You become the priest of their attention, worshipping a god who only appears when it suits them. Symbolic image: a candle melting in front of a mirror, its light flickering brightly while its shape slowly disappears. Alfred Adler once said that human beings are motivated not by past wounds, but by future goals, unconscious purposes that shape every behavior. And for many who fall into the identity trap, that goal is often this: to finally be loved by someone who doesn't know how to love. If you can unlock them, soften them, change them, maybe then you'll prove your worth. Maybe then you'll stop feeling disposable. Maybe then the hole in your chest will close. But this is the cruel twist. The more you contort yourself to win their affection, the less you recognize yourself. And the less you recognize yourself, the more you depend on them to define who you are. That's the trap. Soft question: when did you last feel like yourself in their presence? This doesn't happen because you're weak. It happens because you're deeply wired for connection, because you believe in redemption, because you see the good in people, because you were taught perhaps in childhood that love is something you earn, not something you simply are. And when you meet someone who doesn't reciprocate, your instinct isn't to leave. It's to try harder. You begin to see yourself through their eyes. If they're cold, you must be too emotional. If they withdraw, you must be too needy. If they lie, you must have misunderstood. You rewrite reality until it no longer reflects truth, only survival. Carl Jung described the anima and animus as inner psychological figures, our soul's image of the opposite, the partner, the inner beloved. And when we project this ideal onto someone else, we lose the ability to see them clearly. We fall in love with their potential, not their patterns. We become fused with the dream. But the dream doesn't hold. The mask slips, the warmth fades, the pattern repeats, and still, you wait. Because walking away means facing a terrifying question. Who am I without them? It's not just the relationship you fear losing. It's the identity you built inside it, the part of you that fought, sacrificed, endured. That version of you feels heroic, deep, devoted, and letting go feels like betrayal. But it's not. It's a return, a homecoming, The symbolic image here is a snake shedding its skin, the old self lying still and dry behind you, while the new one emerges raw but real. Eventually you begin to feel it. The weight of the compromises, the exhaustion of trying, the silence of your own neglected self. And it hurts not just because of what you lost, but because of what you became in the process of holding on. This is where the healing begins, not with blame, not with revenge, but with reclamation. You begin to ask different questions. Not why did they treat me this way, but why did I stay? Not what's wrong with them, but what part of me believed this was love. And in those questions something cracks open. A voice you haven't heard in a long time, quiet, steady, your own. Carl Jung reminded us that the self is not something we find. It's something we become through truth, through shadow, through integration. And in stepping out of the identity trap you begin that becoming. Not to prove yourself, not to win anyone's love, but because you were never meant to shrink in someone else's absence. You were meant to be whole in your own presence. At first glance, they couldn't be more different. The empath sensitive, giving, emotionally porous. The psychopath cold, calculating, emotionally impenetrable. One aches for connection, often at their own expense. The other avoids it entirely, often at yours. But beneath the surface, something more complex is at play. A subtle symmetry. A strange proximity. Because both the empath and the psychopath are shaped by pain, and both are driven in opposite directions by a fear of vulnerability. The empath learns early that connection is survival, that reading the room keeps them safe, that tuning into others' anticipating needs, softening tone, absorbing pain, earns them love, or at least less rejection. They become hyper-aware of emotional cues. They seek harmony not because they're weak, but because chaos once cost them something they couldn't afford to lose. The psychopath, too, is shaped by early experiences, but they make the opposite adaptation. Where the empath opens, the psychopath closes. Where the empath feels everything, the psychopath feels nothing. Where one dissolves boundaries to stay safe, the other builds walls, too high to climb. And both strategies work in the short term. Soft paradox. One copes by disappearing into others. The other copes by erasing others entirely. In both cases, love becomes conditional, earned, managed, not freely given or received. And the deeper truth is, this neither path is chosen. Both are inherited, unconsciously sculpted by an emotional environment where safety was inconsistent, where the child had to adapt just to make it through. Gabor Mate reminds us that every behavioral pattern is at its core a survival mechanism. Not a defect, not a destiny, but a response. The empath's over-attunement is a way to stay needed. The psychopath's detachment is a way to stay untouchable. And in that light, the difference isn't about goodness or evil. It's about what the nervous system had to do to survive. Symbolic image: two children standing back to back in a burning house, one screaming for help, the other already walking away. This may explain the strange pull between empaths and psychopaths. The empath feels magnetized, not just by the confidence or charisma, but by the silence, the unreadable expression, the emotional void that awakens their oldest instinct. If I can just understand this, maybe I can earn safety. Maybe I can fix what was never mine to fix. And the psychopath. They're often drawn to empaths because empaths respond. They engage, they mirror, they forgive, they stay. The empath's emotional labor becomes the perfect fuel for the psychopath's control, not through rage, but through calm, measured detachment. But the line between them isn't just defined by role. It's defined by awareness. The empath, once conscious of their pattern, can begin to heal. They can learn to set boundaries, to feel their own needs, to stop overextending as a form of self-worth. They can recognize when their desire to help is a masked desire to be chosen. The psychopath, by contrast, rarely seeks this kind of healing, not because they can't, but because they don't feel the rupture. There is no inner alarm, no grief to prompt reflection. The shadow has become the self. Soft question: what if the part of you that clings is trying to rescue your own younger self, not the person in front of you? Carl Jung believed that healing doesn't happen by rejecting the shadow, but by integrating it. For the empath, this often means reclaiming anger, assertiveness, the right to say no, the willingness to disappoint, the courage to be seen without shape-shifting. And in doing so, something beautiful happens. They stop attracting those who feed off their giving, because they're no longer trying to heal through others. They've turned inward. They've remembered their own presence. But until then, the dance between empath and psychopath continues, one seeking to connect, the other to control, one melting the other, measuring. And in that space, the empath risks losing their identity entirely. Symbolic image: a bird flying in circles around a statue, hoping the stillness will one day open its wings. The danger here is not in feeling too much. It's in ignoring the feeling that says this isn't love. That whisper in your gut, that flicker of fear in your chest. The moment you realized you were alone, even while being held, the ache of trying to matter to someone who didn't register your presence beyond its utility. And yet we return. We try again. Not because we're foolish, but because the wound hasn't closed. Because we're still hoping this time the story will end differently. That if we just love better, stronger, deeper, the other will finally feel something. But here's the truth: you are not their unfinished symphony. You are not their redemption arc. You are not the balm for their numbness. You are the one who feels. And that's not a weakness. That's not something to outgrow. That's the signal, the sign, the sacred thread. Carl Jung said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." And maybe that's the only way out of this dance, not by studying the other, but by returning to yourself. By seeing your empathy not as bait, but as birthright. Not something to weaponize or withhold, but to honor, wisely. Because you were never meant to be consumed. You were meant to feel fully, fiercely, freely. And anyone who treats that as weakness has already forgotten what it means to be human. You'd think the mask would fail eventually. That in a world full of people, someone would notice the absence behind the charm. The emotional vacancy behind the performance. But here's the paradox. The world doesn't just tolerate the mask, it often rewards it. Especially when it's polished, confident, and useful. In boardrooms, on stages, in politics, in high-stakes negotiations. The ability to suppress emotion, stay composed, manipulate perception, and maintain control under pressure. These aren't red flags in our culture. They're qualifications, and so the psychopath with their steady voice, cool gaze, and absence of remorse rises. Not by force, but by fitting into the blueprint we've designed for success. We reward image over integrity, outcomes over empathy, presence over sincerity. And in doing so, we mistake detachment for discipline. We confuse manipulation with leadership. Soft paradox. The same traits that make someone dangerous in intimacy often make them desirable in society. Think about the qualities we're taught to admire: confidence, charisma, control, the ability to stay unfazed under pressure, the willingness to do what it takes, the charm to win people over, the logic to cut through emotion. These aren't inherently bad, but without conscience, without empathy, they become tools of harm. And yet they're often mistaken for strength. Symbolic image: a gold medal hanging from a hollow figure, applauded, photographed, celebrated, but with no heart inside. This is why so many people walk away from toxic relationships only to watch the other person thrive. They get promotions, new partners, public praise. They seem untouched by the harm they caused. And you, the one who felt everything, who doubted yourself, who tried to understand, you're left wondering, was it all in my head? No, it wasn't. But the world isn't built to measure harm by emotional depth. It's built to measure success by external performance, and psychopaths are often masters of performance. Carl Jung warned that when we deny the shadow both personally and culturally, it governs us from behind. And perhaps this is how the mask endures, because it reflects not just individual pathology, but collective denial. We're uncomfortable with vulnerability. We reward emotional suppression. We admire certainty even when it's false. And in doing so, we elevate those who can mimic connection without being changed by it, who can speak of love without risking it, who can imitate remorse without feeling it. Soft question: how much of what you admire is actually someone else's mask? This isn't just about individuals, it's about systems, corporations that value profit over people, institutions that reward silence over truth, social media that amplifies performance over presence. The mask isn't an anomaly, it's an adaptation, one that flourishes in a culture that equates control with competence. You might notice it in the small things: the way vulnerability is seen as weakness in professional settings, the way emotional honesty is mocked or minimized, the way efficiency is prioritized over well-being. Slowly, subtly, we shape ourselves to survive in a world that doesn't make space for feeling. And those who feel less or who never felt to begin with rise quickly, because they are not slowed by remorse, not haunted by regret, not pulled by compassion. They move in straight lines. And in a culture obsessed with results, straight lines are rewarded. Symbolic image, a staircase made of mirrors, reflecting light climbing upward but offering no ground to stand on. But there's a cost, not always to them, but to the people around them, the ones who soften, who bend, who feel, the ones who believe that truth lives in the messy, the uncertain, the slow. These people, empaths, artists, caregivers, truth-tellers, often feel like they're falling behind. Because they pause, they care, they reflect. And reflection doesn't trend. Still, this isn't a call to change who you are. It's a call to see clearly, to recognize that when society rewards the mask, it doesn't mean the mask is true. It just means we've stopped looking beneath it. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And becoming real in a world addicted to illusion is a kind of quiet rebellion." Soft question. Are you succeeding? Or are you performing success for someone else's approval? The more you reclaim your emotional truth, the more you slow down. Speak honestly, show up messily, the less appealing the mask becomes, not just in others, but in yourself. You stop needing to look composed, you stop needing others to validate your worth. You begin to recognize your own reflection again, not as an image, but as a presence. And in doing so, you stop handing your power to those who perform better than they feel. You begin to redefine what strength looks like. Not coldness, but warmth that stays soft under pressure. Not manipulation, but communication rooted in care. Not control, but clarity without cruelty. The mask may still rise in society, it may still win applause, but it can't offer meaning, and it can't offer love. Only presence can do that. Only someone who feels deeply even when it hurts can meet you there. And when you meet someone like that, you'll know, because they'll look at you not with the gaze of a mirror, but with the eyes of someone who sees and stays. It doesn't hit all at once. The healing, the clarity, the return to self. It comes slowly like fog lifting over still water, like breath after drowning. You don't even know you were lost until you start to feel yourself again, until you hear your own voice and it no longer echoes back in someone else's language, until your body begins to relax, not because everything is safe, but because you're no longer explaining away the danger. Healing after a psychopathic encounter isn't like healing from ordinary heartbreak. It's deeper, stranger, more disorienting. Because you're not just grieving a person, you're grieving a reality that never existed, a future that was promised but never real, a mirror that never truly reflected you. You replay moments, try to make sense of them, try to decode what was performance and what was real. But eventually you have to accept the hardest truth. Of all, it was all real to you. And that's enough. Soft paradox. The pain wasn't proof of their love, it was proof of yours. At first, your mind clings to questions. Why did they do this? Did they ever care? Were you just supply, just utility, just a name on a list? And then as those questions exhaust themselves, a quieter one begins to rise. Why did I stay, and not in shame, not in blame, but in curiosity, in compassion? Because staying wasn't weakness. It was instinct. You were trying to make sense of something senseless, trying to bring warmth into a cold room, trying to use your empathy like a key. But some doors were never meant to open. Symbolic image, a person holding a key in the middle of a desert, finally realizing there is no door. Carl Jung wrote that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. And maybe this was your fate, until now. Not as punishment, but as a mirror, a reflection of what needed to be seen. That old wound, that ancient ache, the belief that if you just love hard enough, you'll be chosen. That love is something to earn. This encounter didn't create that wound. It revealed it. And now, slowly you begin to close it. Not with walls, but with truth. With the quiet, steady act of feeling your own feelings without needing someone else to reflect them back. You stop performing. You stop explaining. You stop shrinking around others who can't hold your depth. And maybe for a while you don't trust people. That's okay. Maybe you become more careful, more slow. That's not bitterness, that's wisdom. Soft question. What if healing isn't about forgetting what happened, but remembering who you were before it did? You begin to reclaim the rituals of self. Music that doesn't trigger, laughter that isn't measured, silence that feels like peace, not punishment. You stop looking over your shoulder emotionally, stop waiting for the mask to drop, because you're no longer trying to read someone else's mind. You're listening to your own, and it speaks with a voice that's been waiting. Gentle, steady, familiar. The voice that says, "You didn't imagine it, you didn't deserve it, and you are still whole." This kind of healing isn't linear. You'll have moments of doubt, days when their voice still lives in your mind. But over time it fades, not because you forget, but because you remember you. You remember how much love you gave, how much truth you carried, how much softness you preserved in the face of manipulation. And slowly you stop defining yourself by how they treated you. You begin to define yourself by how you return to yourself after they didn't. Symbolic image, a cracked teacup repaired with gold, not perfect, not untouched, but beautiful in its own rebirth. Gabor Mate says that trauma is not the event. It's the disconnection that happens inside of us because of the event. And healing then is reconnection, not just to others, but to the part of you that knew all along. The red flags you ignored, the silences you rationalized, the ache in your body that said this isn't safe. You begin to forgive yourself, not for loving, but for forgetting that love should be mutual. And maybe you don't feel strong yet. That's okay. Maybe strength isn't about armor or walls or moving on quickly. Maybe it's about staying soft, staying present, staying you. Carl Jung believed the soul's path was to make meaning from darkness not by escaping it, but by walking through it awake. And now here you are, awake, not bitter, not broken, but aware. You'll see the mask more easily now. You'll feel the absence behind the charm, and instead of chasing, you'll pause. Instead of bending, you'll breathe. You'll recognize that the absence in them was never yours to fill. And you'll trust that real love, the kind that feels, the kind that stays, will never require you to become invisible. Maybe the most haunting part isn't what they did. It's how close you came to becoming like them, numb, guarded, unwilling to feel. Maybe you didn't want revenge, just a reason, just something to make the pain make sense. But some people move through life untouched by the weight of what they leave behind. They don't carry stories, only strategies. And when you crossed paths, you became one, not because you were weak, but because you were open, alive, real. This isn't a story of monsters. It's a story of masks, of what happens when the mask is rewarded, admired, protected. And what happens to people like you? People who feel deeply when they try to dance with something that was never capable of dancing back. But maybe now you know that emptiness doesn't deserve your echo, that silence is not the same as stability, that love without empathy is just theater, and more than anything, that your softness is not a flaw. It's the part that survived, the part that still knows how to hold, how to hope, how to begin again. So no, you're not crazy, you're not broken, you were just cast in a play that was never meant to be real. And now the curtain falls, and you get to walk off stage, not to forget, but to remember who you were before the script, before the performance, before the mask. You were always real, and that is your power. End of script. Drift gently and I'll meet you in the next thought.